Bom, muito boa tarde a todas as pessoas que estão aqui conosco. Uma saudação especial a Jeffrey Alexander, que pôde estar com a gente nesse momento, que é um momento, acho que antes de qualquer outra coisa, de celebração. A celebração da publicação desse livro, com o qual nós temos nos ocupado há algum tempo com muito carinho. Isso eu acho que realmente é um marco para as ciências sociais brasileiras. Então, é realmente, para a gente, uma ocasião ímpar de poder discutir sobre o livro aqui com o autor. E vou contar para vocês um pouquinho como nós pensamos esse evento. Nós vamos dividir o evento em duas partes. Uma primeira parte um pouco mais institucional, em que a gente vai falar um pouco sobre o livro, sobre a importância da presença da obra de Jeffrey Alexander aqui no contexto das ciências sociais brasileiras. E no segundo bloco, a gente vai ter um momento que é uma entrevista coletiva, uma roda de conversas, em que nós teremos a chance de conversar um pouco mais detalhadamente com o autor. Então, estão aqui com a gente hoje, vou apresentar por ordem das falas, o Paulo Niederle, que é o nosso novo coordenador de área da Sociologia na CAP. Até já adianto que Paulo não vai poder ficar conosco o evento inteiro, porque justamente hoje é a atividade de nomeação dele enquanto novo coordenador. Também estão com a gente a Cynthia Hamlin, que é da Universidade Federal de Pernambuco e coordenadora do CP de Teoria Sociológica, da Sociedade Brasileira de Sociologia. A Simone Brito, da Universidade Federal da Paraíba, que coordena o GT de Teoria Social da ANPOX. Também teremos a participação de um dos organizadores do livro, que é o Lucas Soneghet, que vai nos falar um pouquinho sobre o livro, do André Magnelli, diretor do Ateliê de Humanidades, editor do livro, e também de Frédéric Vandenberghe, também é organizador desse livro, e a participação muito especial da Elisa Reis, né, que conhece Jeffrey de longa data, professora da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, e que nos deu a honra de participar conosco desse evento. Então, eu vou fazer a moderação desse primeiro momento. Jeffrey Alexander, evidentemente, dispensa apresentações, mas vocês terão a chance de conhecer mais sobre ele no decorrer desse evento. Então, quero dar, mais uma vez, as boas-vindas e passo a palavra... sim, antes também quero agradecer o Rodrigo, que é o nosso tradutor, lembrando que esse evento é transmitido num canal em inglês, outro canal em português, e um terceiro canal com os áudios originais, para que vocês tenham a opção de acompanhar nesses diferentes idiomas. O primeiro bloco vai acontecer em português, com tradução para o inglês, e o segundo bloco ele vai ser feito em inglês com a tradução para o português. Então, eu começo passando a palavra para o Paulo Niederle, meu colega aqui de Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul e coordenador da área da Sociologia na CAP. Obrigada, Paulo, por participar aqui desse evento com a gente.
Obrigado, Raquel. Eu que agradeço o convite e a oportunidade. É um enorme prazer estar aqui com vocês. Um agradecimento especial ao próprio Jeffrey Alexander, uma referência obrigatória nas nossas disciplinas há muito tempo, mas a gente tem agora a oportunidade de ter em primeira mão, eu creio que é o primeiro livro em português tratando da obra do Jeffrey. Isso seguramente vai fazer com que alguns textos que muitos já leram em inglês tenham uma difusão ainda maior, e outros textos que para mim não eram conhecidos e que agora eu tive a grata felicidade de ter acesso já por meio do livro. Bom, eu acho que cabe ressaltar aqui nesse momento inicial algumas coisas. Primeiro, a importância dessa discussão e dessa obra no momento em que a gente está na sociologia brasileira, mas não apenas, num repensar da própria discussão sobre teoria sociológica. E esse repensar não tem a ver apenas com quais são os clássicos e os contemporâneos da sociologia, e é uma discussão muito interessante, porque o Jeffrey, para mim, ele é um clássico contemporâneo, super atual, mas com uma obra já vasta de há alguns anos, colocando questões chaves para a gente. Tem uma discussão na área sobre o próprio ensino de teoria e como é que essa teoria ela se articula com o fazer sociológico, com a própria pesquisa. E, para mim, a obra do Jeffrey vai muito além de uma obra sobre teoria, ela é uma obra que também dialoga muito com uma forma de fazer sociológico, e eu acho que os estudantes e os professores, nossos colegas que estão interessados em sociologia cultural, têm muito a aprender com o Jeffrey Alexander e com essa obra em particular, que vai além da sua contribuição teórica. Bem, eu quero, de antemão, também agradecer e, na verdade, parabenizar os organizadores, professor Frédéric Vandenberghe, professora Raquel, professor Lucas, porque vocês, não só nessa obra, mas juntamente aqui com a Cynthia, com a Simone, com vários outros professores, vocês têm sido promovedores de debates teóricos muito importantes no Brasil. Esse é só mais um, e é um elemento fundamental, mas é mais um de uma trajetória muito importante do grupo de pesquisa, do GT da Unpox, do GT da SBS, e ao Ateliê de Humanidades. O Ateliê de Humanidades tem se mostrado como um enorme incentivador de discussões teóricas e não apenas. Acho que essa obra coroa esse trabalho de um grupo que, embora recente, hoje ele é um grupo reconhecido em todo o Brasil pelo que vem fazendo, sobretudo na área de teoria, mas não apenas. Desejo um enorme abraço a todos, que seja um ótimo evento, e parabéns novamente, muito grato, professor Jeffrey, por ter esse tempo para conversar conosco.
Obrigada, Paulo. Vou passar agora, então, a palavra para a Cynthia, né, que coordena o CP de Teoria da SBS, ao lado do Emil Sobotka. E lembrando que esse evento ele é uma organização em parceria também com o CP de Teoria da Unpox e da SBS. Então, Cynthia, obrigada por estar aqui com a gente hoje.
Desculpa, quase que eu não consegui destravar o meu microfone aqui. Obrigada, Raquel. Então, em nome boa tarde a todo mundo, e em nome do Comitê de Teoria Sociológica da Sociedade Brasileira de Sociologia, eu queria dar, primeiramente, as boas-vindas ao professor Jeffrey Alexander e também parabenizar essa iniciativa dos colegas, em particular a Raquel, o Frédéric, o Lucas e o André, por essa organização, tradução e publicação dessa coletânea, que ainda traz como um bônus uma introdução muito instigante ao pensamento do Alexander por Frédéric e Raquel. Como a Elisa Reis sugere na contracapa do volume, é um mistério que a obra do Alexander tenha permanecido tanto tempo sem tradução para o português, especialmente considerando, como o Paulo já disse, né, o impacto da obra dele na formação de estudantes de graduação e de pós-graduação em ciências sociais no Brasil inteiro, desde pelo menos a década de 80. A importância profunda que o Alexander atribui à teoria sociológica ao longo de toda a sua obra, na verdade, aliada também a uma concepção de teoria como um campo de pesquisa relativamente autônomo, também tem inspirado os grupos de trabalho e, mais recentemente, o Comitê de Teoria Sociológica da Sociedade Brasileira de Sociologia. Então, nesse sentido, é com uma imensa alegria que eu me junto às pessoas que estão aqui presentes para acolher e celebrar Jeffrey Alexander em sua versão brasileira. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Cynthia. E enquanto passo a palavra para a Simone Brito, que coordena junto com a Bruna Della Torre de Carvalho e Lima, o ST da Unpox, de Teoria Social, queria só fazer uma pontuação que acho que há um certo protagonismo aqui brasileiro no fato de termos várias mulheres coordenadoras das instituições de teoria social, do CP e do ST. Né? Isso não é algo recorrente no campo da teoria sociológica, então é uma alegria muito grande estar aqui com essas colegas na tarde de hoje. Então, passo a palavra para a Simone.
Obrigada, Raquel. Boa tarde a todos e todas. Então, eu quero também iniciar dando as boas-vindas ao professor Jeffrey Alexander, né, dizer que é um grande prazer para mim, como professora de teoria, tê-lo aqui, porque o artigo, né, o novo movimento teórico, foi muito fundamental, não só para a minha formação, mas acho que para toda a minha geração, para a gente entrar nesse debate de teoria. Então, é uma alegria tê-lo aqui. Quero parabenizar os organizadores, né, e o Ateliê de Humanidades, e eu começo reforçando essa alegria que eu já falei no início, porque eu acredito que a obra de Alexander, além da sua importância para a teoria, ela tem um aspecto particular, que é essa simultaneidade com o campo da sociologia cultural, né? E eu estou pensando nas diversas contribuições que ele traz, né, para pensar problemas extremamente importantes e centrais da cultura contemporânea. Então, eu estou pensando nos trabalhos sobre trauma cultural, questões que, né, me interessam também ao campo da sociologia da moral, sobre valores, responsabilidade moral, sentidos de justiça, democracia. Então, eu acredito que a obra de Alexander, ela atravessa diversos aspectos desse campo, né, desses campos da sociologia cultural e da teoria, fazendo dele um autor fundamental para a gente entender de forma crítica e rigorosa os problemas contemporâneos, especialmente os problemas do Brasil, né? Então, acredito que há várias questões na cultura brasileira, especialmente sobre valores e democracia, para as quais a obra de Alexander traz várias chaves importantes. Então, eu queria só terminar ressaltando a minha alegria por essa tradução, né? A gente sabe a importância que essas traduções têm para a formação, né? Para a formação especialmente em teoria social. Então, acredito que esse é um momento muito importante para a sociologia brasileira ter esses textos em português e ampliar esse conhecimento e o diálogo com a obra de Alexander. Então, é isso. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Simone. Então, agora, para a gente conhecer um pouquinho melhor do conteúdo do livro, para poder divulgar para vocês como foi feita essa seleção, né, essa busca de uma representação, não apenas de um único aspecto da obra, mas tentamos fazer esse panorama que seja suficientemente representativo de toda essa vastidão que é a obra de Alexander. Eu vou convidar o Lucas, que é um dos organizadores do livro, para fazer essa exposição do que trata, afinal, o livro, né? O que vocês vão encontrar quando tiverem o livro em mãos. Contigo, Lucas. Lembrando que o Lucas atualmente trabalha na Universidade Federal Fluminense, né? E é isso aí, Lucas, contigo.
Lucas,
Obrigado,
fala sem
Raquel.
fone de ouvido.
Tá bom. Muito obrigado, Raquel. Queria agradecer ao André, primeiro pela organização, ajuda na organização desse evento, agradecer a presença do Jeffrey, tão generosamente aqui dividindo seu tempo com a gente, agradecer também a Raquel e Fred pelo trabalho de organização desse livro, um trabalho longo e árduo, mas que com certeza valeu muito a pena. Agradeço também a presença de Elisa, da Cynthia, da Simone, do Paulo. Bom, falar da obra do Alexander não é uma tarefa fácil, uma obra tão grande, tão diversa, que engloba áreas como a sociologia cultural, da qual ele é pioneiro, a sociologia política, a metateoria, a teoria sociológica. E falar desse livro, em particular, também não é uma tarefa fácil, né? A gente tem aí o texto mais antigo, de 1987, e o mais recente, de 2018. Porém, o trabalho é feito muito mais fácil e é simplificado pela generosa e belíssima introdução de Raquel Weiss e Frédéric Vandenberghe, que abre o nosso livro, e também pelo trabalho árduo de revisão e editoração do nosso querido André Magnelli. Então, começando pelo começo, pela nossa introdução, eu acredito que ela em si já é uma contribuição extremamente relevante para a sociologia aqui no Brasil. Raquel e Fred, eles fazem uma apresentação bem completa e profunda da obra do Jeffrey, dividindo a trajetória dele em termos de 3 partes, né? Divisão trajetória cronológica, a parte da reconstrução metateórica dos clássicos de 1970 a 1980, a revisão do neofuncionalismo, 1980 até meados de 90, e depois a sociologia cultural, que é o programa de pesquisa que permanece forte e frutífero até hoje, e ainda elencam 4 campos de força temáticos né, na obra, que não necessariamente se dividem cronologicamente, mas se entrecruzam ao longo do percurso, e também, de certa forma, estruturam esse nosso livro, né? Desses 4 campos, a gente elege 3, que vão formar as 3 seções do livro. A primeira, metateoria; a segunda, sociologia cultural e performance social; e a terceira, sociologia política da esfera civil. Nessa primeira sessão, a gente abre o livro com o texto que é Teoria, traduzido pelo Carlos Fabris. A gente encontra nesse texto, já um clássico também moderno da teoria social, a noção de contínuo científico, a partir da qual o Alexander vai elaborar a sua noção de sociologia pós-positivista. Numa leitura com o segundo capítulo, que conforma essa primeira unidade metateórica, a gente tem o novo movimento teórico, traduzido pelo Plínio Dentier, e também um texto já consagrado na sociologia brasileira. Na sociologia pós-positivista, que é apresentada nesses primeiros 2 capítulos, a gente vê que, para o projeto do Alexander, a teoria não é um mero ornamento que é colocado sobre dados concretos, nem é um mero instrumento a ser utilizado nas mãos de um técnico habilidoso. Na verdade, a ciência e a ciência sociológica se produz no contínuo entre um ambiente metafísico e um ambiente empírico, e por mais que nós apostemos na força do real, ou apostemos na força das reflexões e das ideias, a sociologia ela geralmente acaba caindo do lado da sobredeterminação teórica e da subdeterminação empírica, nos termos do Alexander. Isso porque os próprios fenômenos que a gente observa não são objeto de consenso, as próprias observações empíricas não são consensuais. Ainda nesse campo da metateoria que a gente vai encontrar as bases da própria sociologia cultural, que seria a nossa segunda unidade do livro. Entre o materialismo e o simbolismo exacerbado de Marx e Durkheim, entre o idealismo equivocado do Weber e o estrutural funcionalismo demasiado rígido do Parsons, Jeff Alexander vai firmar os seus compromissos teóricos. E esses seriam: a sociologia deve enfatizar a dimensão simbólica e moral da vida social, sem perder de vista seu caráter estruturado, nem a capacidade de agência e transformação dos atores sociais. Então, a gente começa a segunda sessão do livro, intitulada Sociologia Cultural e Performance Social, com o capítulo 3, Programa Forte em Sociologia Cultural, Elementos de uma Hermenêutica Estrutural, traduzido pelo Victor Alessandri, com a revisão técnica da nossa organizadora Raquel Weiss. Nesse texto, a gente vai encontrar as bases da sociologia cultural, que é até hoje praticada pelo autor, por diversos colaboradores ao redor do mundo, identificando uma lacuna nos chamados programas práticos da sociologia cultural da época. O texto foi escrito no final da década de 90, 98. O Alexander vai lançar o programa da sociologia cultural com base em 3 critérios. Primeiro, a autonomia da cultura enquanto variável forte diante das estruturas sociais, das instituições e das ações. Segundo critério, um método de descrição densa, que ele vai chamar de hermenêutica estrutural, que é inspirado em Goethe, mas é compromissado com a explicação da causalidade específica da cultura. Entender o que a cultura faz quando ela faz alguma coisa. E, por último, terceiro critério, um estudo dos mecanismos de transmissão da cultura, sem ignorar as estruturas sociais e as instituições. A hermenêutica estrutural, então, retrata a sociedade não como um jogo de discursos interessados, nem como uma teia de significados que envolve tanto os atores a ponto de amarrá-los, mas como uma espécie de narrativa cujo desenlace não é conhecido e nem dado de antemão. No capítulo 4, a gente tem aí uma virada decisiva na sociologia cultural, um ensaio Pragmática Cultural, a performance social entre ritual e estratégia, traduzido por Gabriel Peters. Nesse capítulo, o programa da sociologia cultural dá um passo decisivo incorporando a noção de performance. Então, entre a rigidez do ritual e o cinismo da estratégia, a gente encontra a virada performativa. Ao performar, Alexander argumenta, os atores organizados buscam a fusão, isto é, a junção do pano de fundo simbólico estruturado, das audiências, dos atores e dos roteiros. Essa fusão ela se torna cada vez mais desafiadora diante da diferenciação funcional da modernidade. Daí, então, o trabalho da sociologia cultural de rastrear, entender e ler, compreender essas performances coletivas em busca de fusão. Nessa fusão, o que acontece, né, o que ocorre é uma mudança nos códigos, né, o que leva um grupo, um trauma, um evento, uma identidade do lado do profano para o sagrado, do indigno para o digno, do invisível para o visível. Em jogo, então, em sociologia cultural, é o estudo das estruturas de significado profundas da vida social em ação e em performance. Fechando essa segunda sessão, a gente tem o capítulo Consciência Icônica, o sentimento material do significado, traduzido por Thales Speroni e Bettina de Oliveira. Aí, na iconicidade, a pragmática cultural encontra matéria, né? A consciência icônica, como definida pelo Alexander, é esse fenômeno que ocorre quando uma matéria esteticamente elaborada evoca sentido e preenche, por assim dizer, um dado significado. Na terceira sessão, a sessão intitulada Sociologia Política da Sociedade Civil, a gente tem 2 textos que já foram publicados em português e 2 textos inéditos. Abrindo o capítulo, tem o texto Ação Coletiva, Cultura e Sociedade Civil, uma nova teoria dos movimentos sociais, traduzido por Vera Pereira. Aqui o Alexander vai sistematizar a literatura dos movimentos sociais e dialogar com Alan Turing para procurar uma revitalização desse campo. Para essa revitalização, o elemento-chave é a sociedade civil, ou a esfera civil, que vai se tornar o norte da reflexão da sociologia cultural e política de Alexander nos últimos anos. Esse espaço moral e político emerge da diferenciação funcional das sociedades modernas e, ao mesmo tempo, de certa forma, o coloca sobre risco. A esfera civil ela permanece relevante contra e a despeito das distorções estruturais trazidas pela própria modernidade, porque ela se revela como a base e o horizonte dos atores mobilizados coletivamente. Esse tema da sociedade civil é elaborado no capítulo 7, a sociedade civil global, traduzido pelo Rodrigo Cantu, e no capítulo 8, progressistas/reacionários, a crise da solidariedade e ameaças às instituições cívicas, traduzido por Abel Martin. No capítulo da sociedade civil global, a universalidade dessa sociologia cultural da esfera civil é testada, é colocada em discussão, enquanto no segundo ela é aplicada numa análise empírica das instituições cívicas nos Estados Unidos pós-Trump. Nesses 2 ensaios, nessa última sessão do livro, o Alexander traz indicações muito importantes para o entendimento da emergência da extrema-direita no mundo hoje, demonstrando aí engajamento crítico e rigor analítico em igual medida. Por fim, para fechar o livro, a gente tem o capítulo Em Defesa da Democracia na América Latina, também inédito no Brasil, traduzido por Rômulo Leles e escrito por Alexander em parceria com Carlo Tognato. Aqui, mais uma vez, a universalidade e a globalidade da esfera civil é testada e tensionada em relação ao contexto latino-americano. Aqui, Alexander e Tognato escrevem contra as interpretações negativas da democracia na América Latina, que insistem em defini-la como resultado de um déficit, de uma incompletude quase patológica, né? Esse tema é antigo nas ciências humanas e sociais brasileiras e ele ganha aqui uma nova roupagem pela sociologia cultural da esfera civil. Como se fechando um círculo, então, esse último capítulo demonstra já o projeto enunciado desde o primeiro, de uma teoria sociológica conceitualmente rigorosa e elaborada, com implicações críticas e normativas, e interessada na compreensão da realidade social em sua diversidade empírica. Eu encerro a minha fala, é um grande prazer estar aqui com vocês.
O André Magnelli, que, como diretor do Ateliê de Humanidades e editor do selo Ateliê de Humanidades, vai nos contar um pouquinho sobre a parte também prática do livro, né? Como se faz para adquirir o livro, contar um pouquinho para a gente desse processo todo. André, contigo a palavra.
Olá, pessoal, boa tarde. Vou falar muito rapidamente, não quero tomar o tempo. Como editor do Ateliê de Humanidades Editorial, uma editora que tem apenas 3 anos, e, felizmente, eu vejo como uma consequência desse trabalho, né, até na fala que foi feita anteriormente, um certo reconhecimento por um compromisso pelo trabalho bem feito e por nossos valores editoriais, né? Mesmo tendo pouco tempo dentro do mercado editorial brasileiro, a gente tem, na nossa instituição em rede de livro, estudo e pesquisa Ateliê de Humanidades, um braço editorial que é o Ateliê de Humanidades Editorial, que acaba, pela própria dinamismo da rede, levando a publicação de autores e obras absolutamente fundamentais no contexto contemporâneo, né? Creio que, nesse sentido, este livro que está aqui em minhas mãos, que está em pré-lançamento, nós estamos fazendo agora esse debate hoje, Sociologia Cultural, essa aqui é a minha versão de prova, ele é uma consolidação desse trabalho, publicando, como já foi dito aqui, o trabalho dos maiores sociólogos internacionais, norte-americanos, também, vivo, dentro do contexto contemporâneo, e que não tinha ainda alcançado uma publicação à altura de sua importância, da sua obra e do seu pensamento. Ainda que tivesse um impacto muito grande no âmbito do pensamento sociológico brasileiro, e ainda que Jeffrey tivesse uma relação com o Brasil, infelizmente não tinha tido ainda a sua obra publicada. Então, Sociologia Cultural, Teoria, Performance, Política, faz esse movimento, mostrando bem, digamos, o dinamismo de rede e fazendo um trabalho comprometido com a missão editorial, né, do Ateliê de Humanidades e também, obviamente, da nossa rede. Se antes já estávamos fazendo a publicação na Biblioteca do Pensamento Político da obra de Pierre Rosanvallon, que é um dos principais, se não o principal pensador da democracia no âmbito da articulação entre teoria democrática e história do político, agora temos a felicidade também de estar a publicar um dos nossos maiores sociólogos contemporâneos, Jeffrey Alexander. Felizmente, é um sentimento de um trabalho sendo cumprido, e ainda com muito a se fazer. Espero que seja apenas a primeira obra de outras de Jeffrey sendo publicadas em português pelo Ateliê de Humanidades Editorial. Última observação, mais operacional, tá? Só se publicam livros com relevância, desde que eles sejam lidos e apropriados pelo público leitor, debatidos, recebidos e, obviamente, comprados. Então, acesse o site do Ateliê de Humanidades Editorial, do Ateliê de Humanidades para adquiri-lo. Vocês podem adquirir também na Amazon. E, adquirindo o livro, vocês começam a recebê-lo, os livros começam a ser enviados a partir do dia 3 de janeiro. Você também pode se tornar sócio-leitor do Ateliê de Humanidades, do Clube Ateliê. É só visitar o Ateliê de Humanidades na Catarse para receber todo mês um livro do Ateliê de Humanidades ou de parceiros, editoras parceiras, aderindo até o dia 5 de janeiro, vocês estarão recebendo Jeffrey Alexander, o Sociologia Cultural, nesse mês de janeiro, e depois, no mês de fevereiro, tem também um lançamento do Ateliê de Humanidades, que é Democracia e Verdade, uma breve história de Sofia Rosenfeld, um belo livro, que vai ser o livro de fevereiro. Tá? Só então acessar o Ateliê de Humanidades na Catarse e aderir ao plano sócio-leitor. É isso. Falou aqui o editor, depois retorna também um pouquinho só, o meu aspecto também de sociólogo. Um abraço e sigamos a nossa conversa.
Obrigada, André. Só reforçar que acho que é uma importância muito grande que esse livro esteja saindo pelo Ateliê de Humanidades, né? Que é uma editora que ainda é pequena, mas muito séria, muito comprometida, tem feito um trabalho de excelente qualidade. Eu acho que é fundamental que a gente possa apoiar as pequenas editoras, porque são elas que, de fato, estão sustentando não só o mercado editorial, mas o debate realmente relevante atualmente, né? Então, te agradecer por ter acolhido esse projeto, por essa parceria, pelo trabalho tão rigoroso que você fez na revisão das provas, na preparação do manuscrito. Então, quem quiser comprar de presente de Natal, de repente dá um voucherzinho ali para o livro chegar em janeiro, mas já dá para comprar como presente de Natal, né, André? Então, agora a gente vai passar para o segundo bloco, que vai ser, como eu disse, nós vamos migrar para o inglês. Eu começo passando a palavra do Frédéric Vandenberghe, que também é professor da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, um dos organizadores desse livro, referência na área de teoria, não só no Brasil, mas internacionalmente, querido colega, amigo, que vai fazer essa passagem, então, para o segundo momento do nosso dia.
Obrigado, Raquel. E, de fato, agora a gente vai mudar e passar do português para o inglês. So I apologize to our Brazilian audience, but in the second part, it will become much more conversational. We will have, and we agreed with Jeffrey Alexander to have a collective interview. And actually, when you think about it, Zoom is such a wonderful thing. I remember during the pandemic, we were all suffering, but in fact, being able to have an intercontinental conversation with actually something like 50 degrees Celsius of difference is something really amazing. And I really want to thank Jeff for being present here with us and for accepting the challenge. I also want to thank the Atelier, because nowadays what is actually important is not just the publication of the books, but especially, in fact, the promotion of the book, the discussion of the book. And André has been doing that for the last years. And so that is, in fact, what makes a book alive. It's the ideas, it's the discussion about the ideas, and I very much support it. I also like very much the presentation of Lucas, what it took me, and I'm looking at Elisa as well, what it took us 30 years to accompany, and Jeff 40 years to work out. We basically had it in a synoptic overview. The first part had its official part as well, because Jeffrey Alexander is really one of the elder statesmen in the discipline. What is interesting, and what will be a little bit surprising for Jeff, is that, in fact, the first phase of his work on sociological, on social theory, meta theory, and the reinterpretation of the classics, that is, in fact, how your work has been received here in Brazil. The text on the new theoretical movement was actually published in Brazil in Portuguese before it even came out in English, and this text has become an absolute classic. I think that the cultural sociology has kind of been received a little bit. The civil society has been received via your interpretations of the present. I mean, the backlash, frontlash article. But of course, when I said that we would have a collective interview, and that you said, well, just surprised me. We were ourselves quite surprised when we were coming together, how the questions, in fact, are to a large extent theoretical questions. Theoretic questions about the field of social theory, the situation of cultural sociology within social theory, and that is really what we will try to do here together. I must also thank once again the translators, everyone who has been involved in translation of those texts, because we did it, in fact, just with a lot of enthusiasm. Even if the book has come out late, it was ready in 2019, but then for a lot of reasons that we don't have to go into here, it took us a lot of time. But I want to thank each and every one of the translators who have been with us, and I even think I should mention them by name. Carlos Fabris, Vittor Alessandri, Gabriel Peters, Thales Peroni, and Bettina Sermanski, Avia Marpin, Romulu Lelis. You will all receive the book as a sign of our gratitude in the next weeks. Now, one thing that is important in this collective interview is just that the flow has to be flowing. It has to be pleasant. It has to be engaging. And in this sense, we also need space for a little bit of spontaneity. So what I will do now is I will pass the floor to Lucas, who will be our mestre de ceremonia. And from there, we will take it and we will see how it goes. We have some bit less than an hour, because then I think that everybody, and especially the audience, will get tired. But so let's have a go at it. And once again, thank you all for being here. Jeff, please.
Somebody's knocking on the door at my house. I'll be back in 30 seconds.
Okay. Lucas, durante este tempo?
Sim. Então, gente, só para falar também para o pessoal que estava ouvindo em inglês, a gente vai ter agora um momento de perguntas e respostas, a gente vai ter. E a gente está só esperando o Jeffrey voltar e a gente começa. Tá certo?
Certo. Eu queria, na verdade, fazer uma pergunta a Elisa, porque quando disse que este texto é um novo movimento teórico que está em todos os cursos de teoria, e qualquer teórico ou qualquer teórica no Brasil que se respeita conhece este texto. Você poderia contar um pouco essa história deste texto, porque eu acho que, na verdade, é você que trouxe e o texto e o Jeffrey para o Brasil.
Fala em português ainda?
Eu acho que sim.
Tá. Bom, na verdade, eu não conhecia o Jeff quando um ex-aluno dele, na UCLA, sugeriu que a gente o convidasse para a reunião anual da Unpox, que naquele ano, excepcionalmente, foi em Campos do Jordão, e não onde costumava ser. E eu fui escalada para comentar, eu e o Sérgio Micelli. E tivemos um diálogo muito interessante com o Jeff desde então, e como eu ensinava cursos de teoria no UPEG na época, né? E os meus alunos gostaram muito do artigo também, e houve como que isso foi publicado na Revista Brasileira de Estudos Sociais, né, revista da Unpox. Eu acho que o que era mais atraente para o público brasileiro era ter um mapa tão completo da sociologia pós-parsoniana, que a gente, cada instituição conhecia um lado da sociologia contemporânea daquele período, né? Então, o que o Jeff nos deu muito generosamente foi uma visão panorâmica do que era a sociologia pós-parsoniana. Eu acho que isso explica muito do sucesso que o artigo teve desde então.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for this kind and generous introduction. So we're going to start our Q&A session. First of all, I would like to hand over the floor to Frédéric. Frédéric, go ahead.
Jeffrey, your text, The New Theoretical Movement, which is really a standard text in all courses of sociological theory here in Brazil, was written in 1988. My question to you is, what happened with the movement? If you had to rewrite the article, what would you actually say? Or the old lines and themes still relevant? What structures the contemporary field of social theory? Do you still consider theoretical debate a central feature of the discipline? Or would you say that meta-theory and social theory have now simply disappeared? And if you want to theorize, well, go to the studies, and that is where you will find the theory. But cultural sociology is no longer into the business of social theory, let alone meta-theory. So what would you respond to those questions?
Well, Fred, first I just want to thank, the translators, as Fred did, and also Paula, Cynthia, Simone, and Lucas, and of course the publisher, André. Thank you for that. And Elisa, who first brought me to Brazil. Now, I mean, I think that in that new theoretical movement, I was trying to talk about, it was a meta-theoretical essay, obviously, and I was trying to identify what was emerging out of and past the conflicts between Parsons and his critics that were preoccupied the period from, I don't know, the early 60s, or maybe even the late 50s until the early 70s. I was trying to identify some exciting and positive new developments, and to show that there was, in a way, a convergence and not on certain meta-theoretical issues like agency was important, micro-macro was important, not as antagonists, but as intertwined. Meaning was important, and normativity. And I mean, I still think all those issues, I think that essay didn't end a period, but it was it was like the Owl of Minerva flying at dusk, that it looked backwards. And it did, though it did indicate a shift, because by the late 80s, that period of sociological theory that had extended from, the post-war period, it was dead. But I don't think many people realized it. I mean, conflict theory was still being taught as conflict versus order theory, micro theories versus macro theories. These were the preoccupations of my graduate school career. I mean, from the whole 1970s and the 80s, and that's been gone. I mean, that as a contemporary, it's good to know about those debates, to understand them and what they were about, but beginning in the late 80s, certainly by the 90s, that just wasn't, these weren't the issues that were burning people anymore. So, but another thing, so I think that's an important implication of writing that essay, that it's a kind of a boundary between the before and after, but it didn't lay out a program exactly. It was trying to announce that there was a new set of concerns. But it's interesting that you raised this, Fred, and I think it's true, which is, in a way, after that, by the 90s, sociological theory as a field was much less important, and possibly even disappeared more or less. Why did it disappear? Well, one thing is that the period from the 60s through the 70s and mid 80s was a time of crisis in sociology around the world, but especially a crisis for Parsonianism, et cetera. So there was but it was also the 60s. It was a social crisis, a cultural crisis. And in this period of crisis, there's a movement towards meta considerations, fundamental, paradigmatic, a sense that the foundations of everyday life, both intellectually and politically, are brought into question and debated. So what was happening in society was happening in sociology. And I think that's why all of us, you, me, and Giddens and Habermas and Albin Gouldner and everybody moved towards, we're engaged in like really meta-theoretical, not empirically oriented in a direct sense. I mean, if you take Albin Gouldner, probably nobody even knows who he is anymore. He was a great figure, a brilliant guy. He wrote The Coming Crisis of Western Sociology in like 1971, a tome like this. And he was a very important player. He had been an empirical sociologist at a middle level, let's say, was a student of Merton's. He was always on the left, but it was because of the crisis of the 60s that he became a meta sociologist. Anyway, what I think, two things happened in the years, that maybe the decade after the new theoretical movement. One was that the I don't know, the Western world are kind of calmed down. In a way, the right, you could say the right won in some way. Neoliberalism started and it had a long run for maybe 30 years. Certainly there weren't revolutionary upheavals by the left. But another thing that happened is that, and this is just as important and more intellectually relevant, which is that theory moved out of sociology and into other domains, for example, feminist theory, post-colonial theory, race and sex theory, democratic theory. These became worlds of theorizing onto themselves. And to really be a theorist, you had to be familiar with all these. They in a way were sociological theories. They were certainly social theories. And many of the participants in these debates had been trained or had training in sociology. So that's an interesting split. I mean, I guess you could say critical theory per se was also part of that, although it had been around for a much longer time. So on the one hand, I think there were a lot of new movements outside of sociology. And another thing that happened, which I've realized in talking, is that the people involved in meta theory started doing middle range theoretical studies. I mean, you can look at Giddens as a really good example of this. He was a very important, meta theorist, right? And then he started studying the institutions of the self, reflexivity, psychiatry, mental illness, marriage, family. And I think that happened to me too. I think that I made a shift towards models of social action rather than models of theory. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm going to hand over the word to Raquel. Raquel.
Oh, Jeff, I have one more question on, I would say, meta theory. Sociology, I would say, is once again facing a diagnostic of crisis. And besides the various critiques on its lack of relevance and fragmentation, one of the hottest issues concerns the role of the classics. From the well-known positivistic position to the post-humanistic and the colonial critiques, this strong connection with authors from our past are severely criticized. But for those who try to sustain the relevance of the classics, your paper, Why Read the Classics, remains a mandatory reference. If we take seriously your argument that classics play a role in keeping an operational consensus, how do you see contemporary claims on renewing the canon by including women or authors from different cosmologies? Changing the canon could radically change our collective imagination on what sociology is or should be? Or to put in a simple way, what is your opinion on this ongoing debate about broadening the canon and establishing new classics?
Yeah, that's really a tough question, Raquel. I mean, there's a few ways to answer that. A few answers, for that. One is that there will always be classics. I think I can just, that's a kind of a theoretical claim I would make. And in the essay you're referring to on the centrality of the classics, I make an argument that there there have to be classics. Now, that doesn't mean there have to be the classics that you and I care about. And the reason why there have to be classics is more, in a way, what is the relation of language to speech in Saussure's sense? What do we need? Does society need collective representations in Durkheim's sense? And I would say yes, so that a classic is a kind of generalized symbol of a sacred kind that condenses in the form of a specific set of books and a person, a way of thinking and a way of doing sociology, usually a normative position, explanatory position, etc. And we need these classics because we don't start off as sociologists, inventing all of our general ideas. To the contrary, we're trained, we're socialized. We need what Kuhn called exemplars. Just as we grow up and we don't invent Portuguese or English, we use it. Hopefully we learn to use it critically or creatively, and we invent things. But so the classics are, functionally simply what is taught in our required theory courses, let's say, and we'll always need that. And it also is an efficient way of debating basic theoretical issues like the role of culture, the role of classes, the nature of domination, without really being able to define all of these terms in an abstract way. So instead of saying, what is a class, we say, well, somebody writes what Marx said, or that kind of thing. And I think that's also, that follows from the first point about collective representations. But so I don't agree I don't agree with an argument that would say we don't need classics anymore. The argument I would see as very interesting is the changing status of the classics that we have. And obviously, classics, as literary scholars have shown, classics come in and out of fashion, so that certain authors, certain poets, Shakespeare, etc., they come in for 50 years and they're very important. Then they might fade away and something very important and new comes in. Bach, for example, wasn't considered one of the greatest composers in history until he was rediscovered by Mendelssohn in the early and middle 19th century. And then he became, a classic composer. So classics change, and they should change. In addition, of course, the interpretation of why somebody's work is a classic. And you and I have both been engaged in reinterpreting Durkheim, just as Marx was tremendously reinterpreted from Capital to the early Marx, and reading Capital differently, et cetera, mainly a theory of commodification, not a theory of class conflict. It's a whole different world. But the debate that concerns me and is interesting is this attack on the classics from the point of view of, let's say, race and post-colonial theory, and also gender. And this is a different kind of a critique than the kind I've been talking about, which is to say that a classical work is challenged on the grounds that Durkheim participated in the French Republic, the Third Republic, which was itself engaged in imperialism, and he rarely talked about it as, a big problem. this is, to me, questionable. It's a questionable way to, it's not a good grounds for dismissing the importance of a classic. It's a good way to criticize the work and to show the amazing blinders, the blind spots in mid, late, and early 20th century writings. But I think there's, I think these are mainly normative criticisms, that they're not about the explanatory models, and they also undermine, they ignore the democratic aspirations and implications, let's say, of somebody like Durkheim, or indeed of Marx. I mean, Marx was not too worried about imperialism. Marx didn't mention race as an independent factor. Weber has been, I think, rightly criticized as having a patronizing attitude towards the Jews, at best. I mean, this is a debate we'll have, but I feel myself that let's say the pollution of Durkheim as a white man or as an imperialist, then I want people to show me how that undermines his explanations, his theorizing about egoism, anime, or collective representations. It can be done, but it's not usually what is done. So, I mean, do we dismiss, for example, socialism as an idea? Because in practice, socialism was, it never mentioned race. It didn't mention religion. It took a Stalinist form in the Soviet Union, and et cetera. I don't know. The other thing that's interesting to me is how you can see classics change. So from when I went to graduate school and you read Durkheim, you read The Division of Labor, Rules for Sociological Method, and Suicide. Now in sociology departments, you read The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. It's a dramatic shift and really a completely different classic. Also, at least in the United States and Western Europe, nobody really reads Marx anymore. It's Pierre Bourdieu. So Pierre Bourdieu is, an incredibly influential classic who has taken on some aspects of Marx and Marxism, of course, but is not at all like Marx in the sense of there's not, well, we could talk at length about that, but so, perhaps someday, and, I mean, does Foucault displace Weber? In a way, yes. I mean, in the eyes of many people, Foucault's, because they're on the same theme, rationalization of life. So that's thanks for asking that question, Raquel.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm gonna head over to Elisa. Elisa, you have the word.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here among friends and colleagues. I always cherish the opportunity to hear Jeff Alexander, who always has bold and sharp arguments, challenge new roads for sociology, and does not neglect what's taking place here and now in the world. But Jeff, going back to the new theoretical movement, there, apart from offering that broad canvas of post-Parsonian sociology, you suggested that there would be a pendulum movement of synthesis and fragmentation. We agree, and you just mentioned, that fragmentation has been long and almost creating new disciplines. But on the other hand, one sees recombination of disciplines like behavioral economics, social psychology, etc. I observed that the strong program of cultural sociology offers a synthesis that puts together insights from philosophy, anthropology, literary studies, art theory, and sociology. Would you consider that cultural sociology is in a way a synthesis in the sense that it bypasses disciplinary borders much beyond sociology?
I never thought of it like that. I mean, I never thought of it like that in relationship to, you know, the new theoretical movement but now that you mention it, I think my interest was always in meta theory, was in synthesis. Like the 20 lectures book is this kind of hopeless attempt, it turned out, of a kind of neo-functionalist synthesis of micro, macro, rational, non-rational, etc., into a kind of neo-Parsonian or post-Parsonian. So I think that, yes, cultural sociology is not, I mean, it arose, I developed it with colleagues and students because the discipline of sociology couldn't incorporate the cultural or linguistic turns that was happening in the 60s and 70s outside of sociology. At least the Birmingham School, the later Birmingham School, was an example of doing the same kind of thing, of, you know, Stuart Hall bringing in semiotics in a big way. So I thought that really what happened is that as functionalist, reasoning was critiqued as a theory of values. So you couldn't talk about values anymore in sociology. There was a problem of how could one talk about meaning collectively. And in order to do that, I turned to symbolic anthropology. For example, Clifford Geertz, Mary Douglas, Victor Turner, Marshall Solins. I remember the first time I was in Brazil in '86, I discovered I was introduced to some of the great cultural anthropologists in Brazil. I also was turned, you know, very much to Roland Barthes and to the semiotics in the French world, and some Italian, and I also then tried to metabolize literary theory, especially theories of narrativity and textuality, and then finally, well, maybe not finally, but was theater studies and performance, which I again took in. Now my goal, and then the last thing I did was develop iconicity based on aesthetics, using aesthetic theory to try to find a way of bringing materiality in. But my goal was always to create a sociology, not to reproduce these other disciplines, not to have an eclectic. So my challenge as a theorist always was, in terms of cultural sociology, could I create a coherent model of, let's say, codes and narratives and icons that would be both meta-theoretical and middle-range modeling. But yes, it's a work of synthesis that is, you know, like, is bigger than the sum of its parts, or tries to a synthesis in a Hegelian sense of moving beyond the thesis and antithesis.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm gonna seize this opportunity to ask a question about cultural sociology, specifically about the role of emotions and feelings in cultural sociology, because I think you open up a space to talk about that with performance theory and with aesthetics. So I would like to hear a little bit from you about, is there a role for emotions and feelings in cultural sociology and also in the civil sphere, maybe?
I mean, that's a question that I've been thinking about for the last few years. And I think that, I mean, the short answer is, I was always surprised when people said that that there wasn't emotions in cultural sociology and that you needed to turn to a sociology of emotions instead. And that doesn't make any sense to me, because I feel that at least the kind of cultural sociology that I've developed is all about emotions. And it's about, but it believes that emotions are triggered and contained by patterns of meanings, which direct emotions, call on them in a sense to be, they show people, they evoke emotions. To me, culture is a language of emotions, like the notion of pollution calls forth disgust, anger, etc. Sacrality calls out awe, love, deference. That said, so I don't feel that is simply, that's the difference between cultural sociology and, let's say, cognitive sociology. That it's also the difference between cultural sociology and semiotics. Semiotics was anyway very cognitively oriented and almost like a data machine in some ways. But by going through the late Durkheim and by bringing in notions of narrativity and catharsis, I think that emotions are there. But nonetheless, okay, and the sociology of emotions treats emotions as if they're objects that are out there in the world by themselves, and that social actors project emotion, and people react to emotions as if they're objects. But that isn't true. The emotions are always embedded in stories and in binary codes and in symbols. So I don't feel comfortable with the notion of emotions per se. I mean, Ollie Hochschild's work is a good example of, she's the archetype of emotions, sociology of emotions, but she acts as if actors as separate strategic people have agency or people have power, that they do emotional work. They work on their emotions. I don't think that's exactly how it is. That all of that said, I think there needs to be a lot more work to elaborate emotions in cultural sociology. There's tremendous a depth that needs to be brought out. And for me, it would be brought out by incorporating psychoanalytic ideas, which I don't see being done very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm going to hand it over to André.
Thanks, Lucas. Hi, Jeffrey. I would like to make a connection between your studies of social performance with those of the civil sphere and democracy. In an original update of Durkheim, you go beyond the oppositions between structuralism, hermeneutics, and pragmatism. The result is a systematized analysis of performative processes, failures, and/or successes, infusing and diffusing the public in complex societies. Here I come to the connection with politics. Recently, we have been put to the test by the century of populism, a term by Pierre Rosanvallon, which we have also published here in Ateliê de Humanidades Editorial. Populists have a way of fusing the public and organizing a certain collective action through the polarization between the sacred and the profane. In this movement, we easily enter a process of self-destruction of democracies. In order to reconcile your empirical investigation with your normative perspective, I would like to hear you on one point. How is it possible in our democracies, complex democracies, to generate a collective action that does not operate a populist polarization fusion, that typifies the process of representation and tends to destroy the mediations? In other terms, to put you in dialogue with Rosanvallon, is it possible to mobilize politically while recognizing the complexity of democracy? How can one do this? You mute, Jeffrey.
It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that the identification of, in the last 5 years, let's say, of the intellectual theoretical work that's poured out about populism, which is mostly about extreme right populism, it has a problem at its basis, which is that it treats populism as if it's a completely different animal than the let's say normal emotional and cultural and political dynamics of a democratic, modern democratic society. And so that it talks about, well, populism is performative, populism is emotional, populism engages in othering of its opponents. Well, in my view, that is normal in the civil sphere. These are all things that go on all the time. I mean, the dynamics of othering are core to simply the ideological disputes that dynamize civil spheres and that allow social movements to be powerful and develop. So, and that's just where, so in other words, left and right do other, they pollute and they purify. They perform, they symbolize. They are not rational in the sense of some deliberative democratic model of deliberation organized by constitutionalism and respect for law. They're not a free speech, transparent speech community in the Habermas sense. But that is exactly where you get to the problem that you've put your finger on, which is how does one differentiate or how a populist, a right-wing or left-wing form of extreme populism from the healthy dynamics, I would say, the healthy dynamics of a complex and performative civil sphere. And that's tricky. I tried to do that in the frontlash and backlash essay that is translated in this book. And I also recently wrote an introductory essay to a book called Populism in the Civil Sphere. that came out a year or two ago. I mean, to my mind, I mean, one way of putting this, of course, is in terms of the well-known distinction of agonism versus antagonism, or that there's certain rules of the game that are followed. You have a boxing match, people are trying to kill each other, more or less, hopefully not kill, but they still go back to their corners when, after 3 minutes, they still obey the referee. So the notion of the rules of the game, that's been a traditional way of thinking about it. But I think one could go beyond that and talk about a few more subtle things, because those aren't really sociological arguments. They're kind of normative or legal arguments. One is that in terms of cultural performances, populism is different from the normal civil or let's say healthy civil dynamics, to the degree that the leader becomes a extremely powerful collective representation and develops a cult of personality. And of course, leaders always do become collective representations, but to the degree that that intensifies, such that the followers of the leader become dupes, become on the beck and call, become an army of followers. That's a movement of carrying the dynamics of the civil sphere to a level that is extremely dangerous. For example, Trump in the United States, he has Trumpists, he has his base, as Bolsonaro does. This is a very pathological phenomenon that is converts politics into kind of armed silos and camps. The other thing is, I think, to realize that discourse is very dynamic, othering, performative, but the question is, to what degree does a movement that engages in that, do they want to suppress the autonomy of communicative and regulative institutions? And in my essay on frontlash and backlash, I argue that is the key to distinguish between healthy left and right-wing movements, if you want to call it that, and dangerous anti-democratic populist movements. So in the United States, I'll just stick to the United States, I don't know Brazil that well, that Trump tried to eliminate the independence of journalism by arguing that they were always false facts, that everything that professional journalism produced was a lie. Just as Richard Nixon tried to eliminate the Washington Post, Trump did this, and then he helped to establish his alternative journalistic institutions, like Fox News. And so to me, this is an institutional, a serious institutional problem. And then the other regulative institution is voting is a central way that the civil sphere regulates the state. And if voting is, the institution is corrupted, which is what we're all talking about when we talk about whether somebody is defeated, accepts the results of the election. This is where, you know, it's not because of the discourse and performance others and is highly emotional and impassioned. It's whether at the end of the election, that person will leave. That's critical. Just as the autonomy of the courts are critical. Trump thought that he could appoint judges. He appointed thousands of judges, which is his right, was his right as the president, had to be approved by the Senate. But then he thought that those judges were under his control. And it turned out, no, they weren't, that even conservative judges felt themselves to be autonomous and ruled against him time and time again when Trump tried to steal the election, of course, in 2020. And then I'd say that the role of office is very critical too, but I won't get into that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. We're running out of time on our Q&A session, so I think I'm gonna hand it over to Raquel or Frédéric if they have a question regarding the civil sphere or something in that vicinity. Maybe Raquel, what do you all think?
I guess Freddy has a question about that, right? If not, I can ask.
Fred.
Yes, Jeff, just thinking about the civil sphere. I mean, it took you a long time to write it, as we know, and now we can see that the civil sphere is kind of 17 years later, after you wrote it, is becoming a network. My question would be, why did it take so long for the civil sphere theory to become institutionalized? And if you can explain, let's say, the becoming of the civil sphere in terms of cultural sociology. So it's kind of a reflexive exercise. Why did it take so long? And I mean, would you explain it in terms of organizational, or would you try to explain in terms of symbols, narratives, genres, performances, emotions that took their time to work through?
Okay, Fred. You know, I think so. The civil sphere is a number of articles that, that became chapters appeared in the 90s, really. And then the civil sphere, the Finnish theory, 2006. I mean, I think that, well, one thing I've realized as you're talking, and I hadn't ever thought of this before, is that, but I understood there was a problem. The civil sphere is concerned with justice and incorporation as the grand theories of the sociological tradition are. In fact, at one point I thought of the title of, a theory of justice, a sociological version or something, but it approaches it through the notion of, through a theory of democracy. And democracy, I mean, not in a political science sense, but in terms of democracy is only possible if you have a strong civil solidarity, and that's expressed by having a relative autonomous civil sphere, which can separate from particularistic ties, allows journalism and forms of communication, has these regulatory institutions that can regulate power, etc. Now, I think that in the history of sociology, democracy, it hasn't been a topic, really. I mean, democracy, in a way, sociology defined itself as not concerned with political issues like democracy, but rather with social issues. So social issues, mainly like distribution of resources and domination by class, by state, by race, by gender, and or let's say Durkheimian tradition's notion of a community, enemy, social obligation. I mean, the pragmatist tradition, only Dewey was extraordinarily concerned with democracy. That's something I really is remarkable about Dewey and as a pragmatist philosopher. But Mead doesn't write about that. They transformed the concern about democracy into a very important sociological theory. So I think what I'm saying is that I think the initial reaction to the civil sphere was like, wow, that's a pretty impressive book, but most sociologists weren't concerned with democracy, and they weren't that interested, therefore, in that aspect of this theory. They were so the reactions were more that the main thing people saw in that book was notions of incorporation and multiculturalism, racism, othering, some about the rejection of Jews and things like that. What I think happened, though, in the last 6 years, let's say, 7 years, is people began to realize, sociologists, that, wow, democracy is important, that we're all terrified at moving back into an authoritarian system, and even though we are equally concerned with race, class, gender, sex, there's been a kind of broadening, I think, of how that's understood. And as people have become traumatized by right-wing populism, I think that the civil sphere becomes more relevant, and the notions of the performativity of the civil sphere, notions of how to understand populist versus non-populist movements, and then also the initial critique of the civil sphere was it's just an American theory, so that it's a Western-centric, even some people said, one person, a colonial theory, but I worked hard to try to counteract that by working with people outside the West and outside the North to, elaborate the richness of the theory, the possibilities, both that civil sphere isn't a Western or isn't an American idea, and that it's kind of it doesn't have a nationality, it doesn't have a region. It's inherent to efforts to create a good society, a just society, an incorporative society. And I wanted to show that to be true by working with sociologists in East Asia, in Latin America, in Scandinavia, and most recently in Canada and in India to try to show that. And I think that those efforts have maybe been somewhat successful in showing the more universal quality of the theory.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Raquel, go ahead.
Well, I guess now this is probably the last question. In your book, The Dark Side of Modernity, you claim that social theories should consider that evil is part of modernity. I would like to address a slightly different question. How about different conceptions of good that emerge in different regions of the globe? The backlash of modernity is just about this constant balance between good and evil, or we should take it as clashing conceptions of the good. This is, of course, still the question about relativism. How we can address this challenge from a sociological and normative point of view?
Well, I haven't thought of that before, but you're right. I mean, but I mean, the clash between good, making evil in order to emphasize the good, which is what my argument is, that we need societies produce powerful notions of darkness and pollution in order to, they have to do that in order to define in a relational and semiotic sense, or in a narrative sense, what is good. And I argue that cultural sociology, well, I argue culture is organized around these binaries of good and evil, and that the problem with the ways culture was treated previously in sociology is mostly it was defined as theories of the good. Now, you're suggesting that there's a conflict or much about different theories of the good, and that's true. Like, you know, a liberal notion, a communitarian notion, the arguments between normative thinkers like Walzer versus Rawls, or notions of free markets. I mean, that's true. That's another way to look at it. But I would say that, and I would like to see more about that. And the civil sphere theory ignores or doesn't get into that level of specificity. Like, in fact, I argue that against this debate, there's been a big debate for the last 60, 80 years in the United States about what was revolutionary ideology in the United States when it was founded and in its initial years, and the debates between liberalism on the one hand and republicanism, for example, on the other. It's a gigantic historiographic debate. And then you also get into, it's about Protestantism. And that gets into, of course, well, anyway, but I think that good versus good is also going to be translated as good and evil. I mean, a liberal theorist makes republicanism evil. Most Republican theorists, I'm talking about philosophers, I mean, normative political theorists, they consider liberalism evil. They think liberalism undermined the cohesion of Republican solidarity and community. So I'm not. I think that the civil sphere, as a notion organized around the notion of a civil solidarity, very widespread, it will be articulated in different regions and in different historical times by different specific understandings of what a civil good is. So that, like in France, there's not a very big liberal tradition. In fact, it's very small. It's a Republican democracy. The civil sphere is defined in a Republican manner. It's hard to find liberal theorists in the history of France. I mean, Durkheim is not a liberal theorist, I think, you know, if you want to use normative understandings. And just there's only a few people like Raymond Aron, who was a liberal, liked Tocqueville, who was a mixture, but he's kind of isolated in France, whereas in the US, it's quite different. Most, you know, liberalism is a powerful tradition here. But the way liberalism is practiced, I think, is in often a Republican way. That might be the difference between left and right. I don't know if that's addressed what you were getting at or not.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Since we're running out of time, I'm going to suggest that Frédéric maybe asks a parting question. And then I would like that everyone present, if they wish to do so, can say their goodbyes and maybe some final comments to Jeffrey. Frédéric, go ahead.
Well, just out of curiosity, you celebrated your 75th birthday and you're going to retire. Does retirement mean that you're going to work more and open new projects, or what are you going to do in the next year? What is the big thing that we may expect from you?
Yeah, I've been giving that a lot of thought, Frédéric. I mean, for me, retirement means not having to do the busy work, of a professor, and there's a lot of meetings. I've always been a very institutionally oriented person. I do go to the meetings. I did chair 2 departments. You also in the United States have to do a lot of undergraduate teaching. In addition, I mean, so that takes a lot of time. I'm getting older. How many years do I have left of creative work? I want to maximize my time to do my writing, my research and writing. The one thing that I really will regret about that is not being able to probably supervise, more generations of doctoral students here, but that also is a hell of a lot of work, as you know. It's good work, and I couldn't be happier having done that, but I think my work is now, I don't supervise, but I work with younger people all over the world, and I have correspondence, so I'm going to get away from supervision, although I intend to continue to be in residence here at CCS, Center for Cultural Sociology, in the fall, and I'm allowed to continue to be on students' committees, even as an emeritus. I just can't supervise them. The projects that I want to do, I mean, I'm in the middle of trying to bring my iconic essays into a book on iconic consciousness, and that means exploring a lot of new chapters. I finished a chapter on how nature became iconic last summer, and I'm very near to finishing on a long chapter on architecture, and I want to write a chapter on iconocapitalism and on iconic politics. So those are, that's, I hope I'll have that done. I'm going to publish a book of my cultural sociology lectures that I'm working on with a graduate student. I'm going to pull essays together on civil repair on one hand and backlash on the other. The other big project that I would like to be able to do would be to write about about the global civil sphere, to understand, on the one hand, to emphasize the limitations of the nation state as a container for civil sphere, and how incredibly dangerous that container is, because obviously it's why that's the reason we have wars in modern societies. And I'm just like when I was in the 60s and I was an anti-Vietnam War activist, I've never lost my my concern, my hatred of war. And I really feel that one of the fallacies, the failures of our discipline in social theory in general, is that it hasn't really taken on international issues, what we call IR, international relations, is a subfield of political science, and it's a very shallow, I mean, there's a lot of brilliant people in it, but it's a pretty mechanistic way of looking at things. I think I could try to expand civil sphere theory to look at what has been globalized and what can be, like some mediated symbols, social movements like Me Too, colonial, post-colonial, anti-colonial, but what is lacking, I want to understand it in a non-utopian way. I don't want to rant, I don't like say, yeah, we have a global civil society, which we clearly don't, and that was one of the problems with the Giddens School and at LSE and in the 90s. But on the other hand, so maybe that work will contribute to something, I don't know what, we'll see. So those are my ambitions in my retirement years.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a whole program, and so I think it's now time to wrap it up. I really thank you, Jeffy, for your presence, everybody here for animating this discussion. And one of the nice things when you have a small publisher that is publishing a big book is that they promote it, and there may even be a second or a third round. And that I think will be really interesting to strengthen the ties, in fact, between both of the Americas. And I think with your civil sphere, and especially the last chapter in the book, which is about the civil sphere in Latin America, there's a whole continent there in terms of theories and that will have to be explored. And I think for the Brazilians, it will be absolutely wonderful, because they know your work on social theory and know they are going to discover also cultural sociology and civil sphere theory. So thank you for being here with us. And I will leave the last word to you and to Elisa, because both of you are kind of friends. And so I have the privilege to distribute the word to you. Thank you to everybody. And please, Jeff, and please, Elisa.
I mean, I just said that I'm very, it's a tremendous opportunity for me to have this translated into Portuguese in Brazil. And Brazil has always been, as it has been to many people, a fascinating and important country. I mean, everybody's always said Brazil is the future. Brazil is the future of Latin America, the future of the world, and it's never quite gotten there, but it's certainly the present, and it has just such tremendous potential, and a really vigorous cosmopolitan intellectual and artistic life. So I'm glad that my work has been translated, because I have been very frustrated by the focus on my meta-theoretical work from the 1980s. I mean, when I went to China in 2015, I was like, oh, nobody knew anything about my work after like 1987, something like that, 88, 89. And it was just it's frustrating. So I think, to me, one of the nice things about your volume is it covers the span, and they are related to each other, but it also introduces people to more recent parts of my work. So Fred, I really have to thank you personally for making this possible, and also to Raquel for whose essay on my Durkheim interpretation is definitely the best essay I've ever read along those lines. And I'm dumbstruck with admiration at that essay. So I'm really grateful to both of you for doing that. And I look forward to seeing you, some of you, or at least you and Elisa in Melbourne.
Yeah, if I have the privilege to say something, I would just say that it's always a pleasure, as I said, to hear Jeff. And I know we are the same generation, but beyond generation, we have so many concerns in common. I mean, I come from political science originally, so to see you, Jeff, concerned about the democracy in sociological terms is very rewarding. I look forward to new conversations on that. And I think we also share some enlightenment ideal. We are always supposing that the front-left movements will overcome the backlash, and we go on that. It's a pleasure to hear you. Thank you very much, Fred and Raquel, for the opportunity to be here with all of you. And I look forward to seeing you in Melbourne.
Raquel, se quiser falar também, dizer seus comentários.
Just to say thank you, you Lucas and Fred, for the partnership in organizing the book. Thank you, André, everyone who is here today, and especially thanks to Jeffrey to be able to have this very intriguing and exciting afternoon for us. And I hope we can meet very soon, or online, or maybe somewhere in this big world.
Thank you, Raquel. André, if you want.
Falo em português agora, para poder concluir falando com o público brasileiro. Muito obrigado a todos pela presença. Os vídeos depois vão estar disponíveis no formato português, inglês e original, editados também em formato de podcast no República de Ideias. Tá? Então, vocês também vão poder ouvir ao lançamento, para lançamento. Muito obrigado, Jeff e Alexander, pela presença. Muito obrigado a todos. A Simone, a Cynthia, ao Paulo, a Elisa, ao Frédéric, a Raquel, ao Lucas, ao Rodrigo como tradutor. E queria reforçar da importância de os livros eles serem adquiridos, lidos, recebidos. Né? Adquiridos é a parte comercial que é importante, que permite que o processo de produção editorial continue existindo. Ainda que PDFs sejam uma forma de acessibilidade, se não se constitui um mercado autônomo de livros no Brasil, não se produz academicamente no Brasil, e não se tem a possibilidade de trazer autores como Jeff Alexander e outros para uma editora. Se não lemos, não recebemos os livros e os autores com qualidade. Felizmente, Jeff Alexander já é muito bem lido, muito bem conhecido. Estamos apenas chegando a uma nova fase da leitura e recepção de Jeff Alexander, com certeza, com uma visão sobre a obra como um todo, e não mais apenas sobre alguns aspectos da obra dele que prevaleceram nos anos 80 e início dos 90. Sociologia cultural, teoria, performance e política está aí, para a gente poder utilizar em graduação, pós-graduação e pesquisa, avançando para o conhecimento da obra dele como um todo. Adquiram no site Ateliê de Humanidades e também na Amazon. Podem também entrar em contato com a gente por WhatsApp, 21 98260 9154. E lembrem que vocês, sendo sócio-leitor do Ateliê de Humanidades, pelo Catarse, vocês vão adquirir o livro, também vão receber em janeiro, e todo mês vai ter livro novo, com material complementar também do ponto de leitura, para se aproximar do livro, conhecer o livro, e ter essa experiência da leitura bem feita, qualificada. Muito obrigado.
Tchau, gente.
Thanks, everyone. Obrigada.
Bye.